So without further ado, welcome to Farmers Weekly Question Time, an evening of topical debate about farming, food and the countryside, recorded in front of a live audience, putting their questions to our expert panel. I'm your host, Johan Tasker. Our venue this evening is the Pentland Suite at SRUC Oatridge, the West Lothian campus of Scotland's Rural College. And at Farmers Weekly, we'd very much like to thank SRUC staff and students for making us feel so welcome here. And a big thank you too to our sponsors, AB Agri and Bank of Scotland, for making this event possible. On our panel this evening, and I'm going to go from your right to your left, Martin Kennedy is president of NFU Scotland, a tenant hill farmer from Aberfeldy, Highland, Perthshire. He farms beef and sheep with his wife Jane and 3 daughters. Nicola Holden is Professor of Food Safety here at SRUC. She runs the research-led Safe and Improved Centre, focusing on a broad range of agri-food production methods. George Burgess is the Scottish Government's Interim Director of Agriculture and Rural Economy, helping to create Scotland's policy framework for farming and rural communities. Dairy farmer Sally Williams is a director of her family's farm in the Scottish Borders, a strong advocate of technology and precision farming. She's a volunteer farmer for the Royal Highland Education Trust, encouraging youngsters into agriculture. And completing our panel is environmental journalist and award-winning author Louise Gray. Louise worked for 5 years as the Daily Telegraph's environment correspondent. Her second book, Avocado Anxiety and Other Stories About Where Your Food Comes From, aims to make people think more carefully about how their food is produced. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for our panel, please. Our first question, Philip Burgess.
Hi, Philip Burgess. I work across James Hutton Institute and SRUC as a potato researcher and consultant. And I'd like to ask the panel, to what extent is Scotland morally obliged to maximise its food production?
To what extent is Scotland morally obliged to maximise its food production? Martin Kennedy.
Absolutely, to a huge degree. I think we should do that. We've got a massive asset that globally is really sought after, and that's water. We curse it every single day, but when it is here, however, we can do an awful lot, and we can do things sometimes with too much water, with too little we can't. What became very stark to me was at COP26 last year in Glasgow. I chaired a panel where I welcomed everybody to this wet, horrible, dreich day in Glasgow, and the chap from Kenya that was sitting on the panel beside me said, "Oh, hang on a minute, this is a fantastic day. You do not know how lucky you are. We do not appreciate water enough." And I'm very upbeat about this because in terms of what we are doing in Scotland, we can do it sustainably. We are doing things extremely sustainably at the minute. Yes, we can all do more, but however, at the present time, from a global perspective, we can produce food well, we can produce it sustainably, and particularly from a livestock point of view, I think we should actually be producing more livestock, because if we don't do it here, we're seeing at the minute the beef price is going north, and if we don't produce it here, we will import it from other parts of the world. Now that's applicable to right across all products, and if we import it from other parts of the world that maybe cannot afford to produce it or grow it or buy it, then we might be part of the reason we're causing humanitarian issues in other parts of the world when we could be producing our own food and produce more of it.
George Burgess from the Scottish Government, is that something that you'd agree with?
I'm going to very largely agree with Martin. I'm sure those of you in the audience are aware of the vision for agriculture that the Scottish Government set out last year, and a key part of that vision is high quality food production, combined with tackling climate change, so climate change adaptation and mitigation and biodiversity, but absolutely food production at the heart of that vision for agriculture in Scotland and for the support package that we are seeking to put in place. We have, as Martin has said, some real natural advantages over many parts of the world that you can think of. At the same time, we must ensure that what we're doing here, we're doing as efficiently as possible, so that we are combining food production with tackling climate change and the biodiversity crisis.
Would any audience members like to come back on that? Sally Williams, can I ask you, how, as a dairy farmer, do you manage to balance food production and the other issues that there are out there in terms of climate change and the environment?
To be controversial right from the beginning, I think dairying has actually been in a really strong position in terms of the balance and thinking about the bigger picture and the consequence, the effect on the environment. Dairy farmers for a long time have been pushing to reduce age at first calving, which sounds so non-scientific and not gobbledygook and impressive that you can't believe that actually that's going to have any effect on anything that we all seem to be talking about. But it's about efficient farming, and for me, dairy farming has led the way. But I'm really fascinated by the use of the morality of whether we should or should not maximise food production in Scotland. And I want to throw it back to you slightly, Philip, to ask, from your perspective, is this because of the what I consider to be the moral bankruptcy of importing everything from countries that we, quite frankly, shouldn't be importing from because they need to support their own populations? Or where, for you, is the morality of this around?
Philip Burgess.
Thank you. I was wanting the expert panel to answer the question, if I knew the answer.
But it's a discussion.
I've travelled quite extensively around the world, and it is very apparent that in a lot of other parts of the world they cannot grow enough food efficiently. They don't have enough rainfall. Water, as you say, is so critical. And Scotland has this massive advantage. And as climate change develops, those advantages, you have to be quite careful how you say this, but they could actually get better. We could be in an even better position in the future in terms of being able to grow a wider range of crops, which is my interest. And I think we should maximise that for the benefit of other parts of the world.
Because I will then qualify my answer, and the reason I threw that back to you slightly is I think we have to be very, very careful around our food security conversation and the maximisation of food production in Scotland. We hear about it all the time. Everyone should eat local, and they should all be supporting British, Scottish, whatever. But at the same time, we are also, as farmers, seeking for the best market for our product. And if that involves export, then how can we refuse to import if we're expecting others to buy what we export? So I see it from, that's where I come at it from, is I think we have to be very careful about that whole conversation in terms of us being on the moral high ground that our population must buy our product and support our farmers, and yet we are also then expecting to produce enough to have surplus to sell elsewhere.
Could I ask Louise Gray, we've already mentioned water, we've already mentioned other parts of the world. Your new book, Avocado Anxiety, is the very title, is about a product which is imported into this country which relies on enormous amounts of water. Where do you come from in terms of this argument?
Well, before I get to that, I think it's a really fascinating question because of the morality you inferred. And my grandfather began farming after the Second World War, and he was told he had a moral obligation to feed people. And that was the way that was what most farmers believed. And it's changing, and I think that's really interesting, that what we would call the productionist model is changing to something else. We need to feed 11 billion people, yes, but without destroying the planet. And in fact, we've got to reverse some of the damage that we've done. So do we have a moral obligation to maximise food production within the limits of the planet? And tatties are a really good example of that, aren't they? Because we can't grow them every year because environmentally that's impossible, and so diversity and things. And to get to Johan's question, I use the word ethical because moral's a little bit too strong, but is it ethical to eat avocados when people in Chile don't have enough water coming to their village because they're being used in the orchards where our avocados are coming from? There is a question over that, but at the same time, they're not as bad as beef for a carbon footprint, which is, and that's a fact. It's a fact, and it's great because in my book I talk about being booed about beef and avocados, and it's all coming to life. But that's true, so it's about, I guess it comes back to the question, it's about balancing the obligation to feed people well with what's best for the environment.
George Burgess, you wanted to come back.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on some of Philip's comments. Climate change, yes, we will see, we're probably already seeing the effects of climate change, and some of those, maybe don't say it loudly, are going to be beneficial for us. There may be crops that we can grow in Scotland in the future that we've not been able to. We might not get to fields of tomatoes. We might need to stick to turnips, but there we go. And as we're in SRUC, I'll give a plug because some of the work that SRUC is leading on genetics and methane emission from cattle is pointing the way to very significant reductions in the methane emissions from cattle, which is one of the big challenges that we've got in that sector. So they might well end up being much more environmentally friendly, as well as tastier than avocados.
Thank you. Is Eleanor Kay here yet? No. I'm going to ask Eleanor's question for her because it fits in well and it's a good question. Eleanor Kay asks, does the quest for net zero put our food safety and our food security at risk? I'm going to ask this one to you, Nicola Holden.
It's a very good question. Thank you. Yeah, I think again, there's challenges, and what we're seeing is potentially emergence of new pathogens as the climate changes, and our measures to mitigate those changes have got impacts as well. So we might see unintended consequences, and that could be, for example, in we've seen the need to reduce or change our packaging or our disposable utensils, for example. So we might see unintended consequences there. So I think that it's really important to look at this as a whole, and to have the scientific backing. That's what us scientists are good at. We can go away, we can actually find the data that goes into these books, or produces the evidence to support some of these findings. But I think it's really important to look at the whole picture. Does that answer the question? Thanks.
Martin Kennedy, does the quest for net zero put our food safety and security at risk?
Yes, it does, and it links back to probably the previous question, because this is about how you do the calculations. Because I think all too often we're looking at calculations, we see where Australia are, where New Zealand are, they're going to be net zero by 2030 with some of their products. It's like having a good accountant. You can do anything with figures, depending on what figures you're using. And I think it's really important, and it links back to Louise's last point on avocados not being as bad as beef. Interesting again. Sorry?
For carbon.
Yeah, okay, so, but interesting though, and talking about carbon, because I'm glad you actually said that, because what Philip said, obviously you said you're James Hutton, Philip, and Pete Ionetta, my cousin's husband's also with James Hutton Institute. He was in Macedonia last year looking at the possibilities of growing other crops in some areas of Macedonia where the carbon assessment, when they looked at it, was actually only 0.5%. Now, a long time ago, they got rid of livestock because they couldn't afford to keep them. Now they've discovered they can't afford not to have them because the carbon in the soil is so low, they can now struggle to grow some of the vegetable crops they're trying to do. So I think it's really important we have look at the sort of the bigger picture here. So this strive for net zero, and going back to probably the previous question again, when we said should we be maximising our production, well, probably the term is optimising, because we've got to take climate change and biodiversity into this mix as well. So when you look at the benefits of livestock From an environmental perspective, so we're very fortunate at home. We've got a lot of ground nesting birds. The only reason we've got ground nesting birds, and I saw 25 lapwings on Sunday when I was feeding sheep, which was fantastic. The only reason they're there is because of grazing management and predators are under control. If that was left to go rank vegetation, they would not be there, and then we're exposing ourselves for wildfires and not having the ability to keep our hillsides in a green carbon sequestrating state. So I think we've got to be very careful we don't look at things in silos. We'll have to take a much wider picture when we're looking at these things. So I think it frustrates me often when the livestock is the one that gets the kicking all the time. However, in many respects we can't do without them, both from a carbon sequestrating point of view, carbon addition to the soils, and from an environmental perspective.
What are you doing on your farm to try and...
We've done quite a lot on our farm over the last number of years. One of the first things we did was a lot more scientific soil testing is what we're doing now, and only applying nutrients where it's actually required. I'm a hill farm, but we're still using variable rate application with lime. We stopped ploughing. It's not for everybody, but we stopped ploughing 11 years ago it will be now, and we're direct drilling. Glyphosate gets a massive kicking, but the reality is we're burning off old pastures now, and we're direct drilling straight into the soil. And I didn't actually buy the driller for a climate change point of view. It's just that I got sick fed up lifting stones every time we went in with a plough. Ploughed it, you lifted stones. You levelled it, you lifted stones. You sowed it, you lifted stones. But the difference is made now. We're very shallow soils at home, very shallow soils. And the reality is we were ploughing and trying to grow plants and grow a crop in the not so productive land. Now we're looking after that soil health so much better. It's reaping huge benefits because we're actually adding to the carbon in the soils. The better crop we now have, we're direct drilling that. We're not now using an insecticide because we used to spray for flea beetle all the time, and I thought it was because we were exposing the plant in the brown soil and it was an easy target for flea beetles. But the Arable guys are saying to me that actually it could be because you're actually enhancing IPM now because you're not taking out the natural predators for aphids. So we've now got the advantage. We've stopped using a flea beetle spray, but we're still using glyphosate. So environmental benefits are far greater. The soil structure's much better now, and the carbon that's in the soil is starting to grow. It's making a huge difference.
There are some, we've already touched on beef. If we look at reducing the carbon footprint of livestock, there are things such as additives to cattle feed to reduce emissions, Nicola. The long-term impacts of things like that, are they the sorts of things that you're looking at from a food safety point of view?
From a food safety point of view, that's a good question. I guess part of that actually brings in the antimicrobial resistance problem as well. So we have to consider AMR bacteria as part of a food safety issue. So yes, I think there are some studies. It's still very much at the research side, but there are some studies at looking at how we can target antimicrobial resistance and make our microbial hazards. Reduce our microbial hazards. So, but there's other additives that we can, put in the animal supplements, for example, that help. You've touched on the greenhouse gas emission story, but again, we need to understand what's actually going to happen with those animals and how it will affect not just maybe one aspect. It could be something like greenhouse gas emission, but we need to actually understand what's happening to the animal as a whole. For those. So that's, as I say, why we need to consider everything and look at those consequences.
Any questions from the audience, particularly on beef? Gentleman there, please. Just wait for the microphone and say who you are and where you're from when it comes along. Thank you.
Thank you. John Pickin, farmer, St Andrews. It's really for the two speakers, Nicola and Martin. Your points about beef and about the sustainability of beef and vegetable growing and everything in Scotland. How much of Scotland could we grow vegetables in? And what would happen to Martin, really, as a beef farmer in the hills? How much beef would we have to get rid of to get to net zero?
Well, in terms of our capacity to grow vegetables, that's going to be down to the correct soil type. So it's all about, it's coming from the soil, really, and it's coming from appropriate land use. So, Scotland has got terrific soil, and it's got very variable productive systems right across the piece. So there are areas where we can increase vegetable production, potentially, but, we have to make sure that it's most appropriate.
But not in Martin's land.
No, not in Martinsland necessarily.
I completely disagree. If you come to Aberfeldy Show, John, every year you'll see the leeks and the onions we've got in that show. I'd be really disappointed if we didn't win it every year. But however, that's probably in an area the size of this table. We've got another 600 hectares that might struggle. But the reality is, I think, we can actually grow, and it keeps coming back to the livestock getting a kicking. I think in terms of growing our carbon stocks, we can do that. I think we can grow vegetables in maybe some other areas that are maybe, but we're focused on, we're very limited in Scotland. We've got only 8% of Scotland is prime agricultural land, and that's under threat from various things right now as well. But let that part of it grow, and let us do the environmental bit, because we can do it very well. But the trouble is, at the minute, we're not getting the recognition for the environmental that we're actually doing. I know full well there's some practices that's not correct, and some practices need to get addressed, but that's in every single walk of life. But the bits that we can do well, let's enhance that and support that. So I think we can do more, and it comes back to that question, because let's not forget, this is about people as well. This is actually about people living and working and having a rural economy that's vibrant, that keeps the lights on, that keeps everything going in rural areas, and it's agriculture that does that, and it's business that does that, because we can't actually forget that farmers and crofters are businesses as well, first and foremost, but the wider benefits that we don't get the recognition for, the spin-off from what agriculture is providing, is never recognised enough, and we need to raise that bar a lot higher.
George Burgess, John Picken raises a good point, or he's almost voiced it. The future for the beef sector in Scotland is something that is increasingly under scrutiny. As the Scottish Government, are you backing beef enough? Do you really want a reduction in the national beef herd?
We are backing beef. And as I've said earlier, we're looking at the measures that we can put in place that allow us to continue the high quality food production in this country and reduce the environmental impact of that. There are measures, there's been a mention there of feed additives. That might be part of the solution. I've already mentioned some of the genetics work that really holds a lot of promise in this area. But just maybe going back to the original question, does the pursuit of net zero put food security at risk? Not pursuing net zero puts our food security at even greater risk. And we talked earlier about the effects of climate change. If you look globally and at the parts of the world where maize and soya are being produced, yes, we might be able to produce more wheat, but lots of the areas that we depend on for maize and soya look like they will have significant reductions in their ability to produce. So if we don't play our part in tackling net zero, we're going to have an even bigger problem of food security. But absolutely, we are backing the red meat sector.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another question.
Sorry, can I come in there? The quest for net zero, I don't want to sound like a dinosaur, but I think we also have to stop apologising for what we do. And there has to become an acceptance that if, as human beings, we need food to live, there is a cost to producing that food. And for me, we are at very real danger of apologising and saying, don't worry, we're the solution. We're so sorry for what we've done and the damage we've done, but don't worry, we're going to fix it and we'll lead the way. It's right we mitigate what we do, but I think there has to be an element of realism. And the idea that we just offset that or we rely on carbon sequestration as a fancy accounting measure to sort us out and make us look net zero is completely disingenuous. So for me, the idea that royalty can fly about and plant 50 trees and that's okay, and yet I've got to reduce my carbon footprint in order for people to have healthy, nutritious food on their plate every single day of their life, I've got a major problem with this. And I think we have to start being less apologetic, deal with it head on without, being saying, it's my fault, it's all my fault. Society is going to have to take responsibility for what society is doing. As business people, it makes business sense for us to become as efficient as possible and reduce our carbon footprint as much as possible. But there is a limit.
Thank you. We're going to come on to trees in a minute. Just a gentleman there, please. Say who you are and where you're from, please.
Thank you. I'm David Hopkins, and I belong here in SRUC some of the time. I put my hand up before Sally Williams had finished her answer, and actually I think she started to get into the question or the comment I was going to make. My comment is, actually, does the panel think we might just be making it too difficult for ourselves, too difficult for agriculture, too difficult for farming, because so much of the attention and so much of the emphasis is being placed on farming's responsibility for net zero, without actually understanding that actually the whole of the societies do. You know, we all participate to some extent in fashion or transport or energy and all the other sectors, and it's maybe it's just too big a question for farming alone to deal with, and it actually has to be an integrated solution with all the other sectors. Quite frankly, there are some things which go on in farming, and Martin talked about storing carbon in his soils. Well, many of the benefits of carbon in your soils actually derive from the fact that it turns over. You can't just lock it away forever, you need it to turn over as well. So I wonder whether we are looking at this as too small a problem.
Thank you very much. We should be looking at things perhaps more broadly. I am going to take Tom French's question, which sort of touches on this in a roundabout way.
Thank you. My question, Tom French, an upland beef and sheep farmer from the true uplands of South Lanarkshire. Against the background of increasing demands on public finances, with nurses, teachers and emergency services all seeking wage increases to cope with the cost of living crisis, is there any way that the Scottish Government's spending of 17 million of taxpayers' cash on a Highland estate for the purposes of planting trees can be justified?
George Burgess, I'm going to ask you this one, or kick off with you. Against the background of increasing demands on public services with nurses, teachers and the emergency services, on public finances with nurses, teachers and the emergency services all seeking wage increases to cope with the cost of living, is there any way that the Scottish Government's spending of £17 million on taxpayers' cash on a Highland estate for the purposes of tree planting can be justified?
Okay, I assume that you're referring to Glenprosen and the forestry's acquisition of that recently. And maybe just linking it with the previous point, we do need to look at this holistically. I think agriculture has suffered, as part of the dealing with climate change. From you have agriculture sitting in one box, and then you have this LULUCF, so land use change and forestry, in another. So things that you might do on your farms to, plant a bit of woodland, that might count in agricalc, but at the end of the day, it's not counting in the agriculture budget. So we actually need to look at agriculture and forestry taken together. And I think that's what our forestry colleagues have actually been doing in Glenprosen. I mean, they've acquired the estate. They have not made any changes to the management of the estate at this point. But we are going to need a significant increase in the planting of trees in Scotland. We're going to need a significant increase in the restoration of peatland across the country. We have far too much peatland that is degrading and emitting huge amounts of carbon. So we actually need to look holistically at these things. And it may well be that the acquisition of Glenprosen is one of the best things that we can do to help in that.
Louise Gray.
I was going to say, isn't a lot of that money, maybe not for Glenprosen, but in the Highlands and Islands, going to come from private funding because of the emerging carbon markets? So the government might be investing now, but in the future, it's going to be a market. People are going to want to plant trees in order to gain carbon credits. So it should take off into something that doesn't require public money. I mean, that's the idea, right?
Tom French, what's your thoughts on this? I mean, presumably you probably think, without wanting to put words in your mouth, that the government should be spending its money elsewhere.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's obscene, almost, the government spending 17 million of taxpayers' cash when there's other more demanding needs for it. As I say, I think it's just obscene that the government can find 17 million, but yet the NHS is in its knees, everything else is in its knees with the cost of living, and there's 17 million washing about in the back pocket that can be buy a Highland estate, which for tree planting, which the merits of are questionable anyway.
Thank you, Laura. Gentleman here. Alan, just say who you are and where you're from.
Alan Bowie, arable farmer from Fife. And it's just coming back to what Louise said earlier about morally or ethically. And we have a calculation here on carbon that morally doesn't apply to food, but it can to trees. So we're allowed in a production process to be able to lock up, or other companies are, to be able to lock up carbon and put it into trees. And yet we produce healthy food here, and Sally touched on it there. And morally, we can't get the correct calculation for allowing us to produce food here, and yet other companies can to offset their carbon. Is that not ethically or morally wrong?
It should never be used to offset.
Well, what do you think is actually happening here, Louise? Because there's actually, the whole argument here is that we have a biological process that produces milk, produces food that we have to eat. Now, you could argue either beef or it could be veg. I'm not going there. But the calculation is such that it's loaded against the farming industry to produce healthy food.
Which is
and
why
morally, well, another thing, morally, I produce barley for whiskey production. Am I going to start worrying about morally that food might create alcoholism or big problems elsewhere?
Yeah.
I produce wheat that goes to gin and vodka production. So as a farmer, I'm really struggling morally and ethically here as to what I'm going to be doing in the future. And I would hope the panel here could maybe allude to that.
Yeah,
Thank
so I think what you're making the point as is if you just focus on carbon, it doesn't make any sense. It skews it. So actually, I'm not arguing just to look at carbon. I'm arguing to look at a life cycle analysis, to look at all of it. But carbon is a big part of that. It's a part of a conversation. It's not, I mean, I thought Martin's point about, you know, what happened when he started direct drilling and he had all these, there were benefits to carbon. So doing these things are complex and they're all improving the environment. So I think carbon's just one element of it, and it's also in the really early stages. I don't know whether they're doing it at SRUC, but certainly at other universities, they're in the really early stages of measuring carbon. They'd acknowledge that it's really early stages of trying to understand, you know, what is the impact of beef when you're taking into account pasture and all these other things. So it's in the early stages. It's not black and white. No one's saying, you know, livestock and beef and carbon are bad because of carbon. They're talking about a whole picture. I don't think it's that black and white.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So we have actually got quite a lot of work in that area. And as you say, measuring carbon, and we have the AgriCult tool is one of the products of the work here as well. And that's, you know, well recognised. It's reasonably well used, I think. And we're not just using it here. We're also being able to compare with other farming systems that maybe actually do incorporate agroforestry, for example.
Yeah.
You know, so it's all about appropriate land use, but then using the carbon calculators to try and look at that whole system, and to see.
Because they did try PepsiCo and Nestle both tried carbon footprinting on labels a few years ago. It didn't work because it doesn't actually reflect the environmental impact, and consumers didn't care and weren't interested. So it's already failed. That they're looking at something much more complex. But you know, but I think it's what we focus on because meat is so emotive, and the whole discussion around it.
George Burgess, just briefly.
Very briefly, just Alan, I look forward to discussing your moral dilemma about your barley, preferably over a dram.
Sally Williams, did you want to?
Just very quickly, Louise brings up what the carbon footprinting of labels and consumers didn't care, and I think that's something that also we need to think about is what is going to drive consumers' behaviour, and I'm not convinced the carbon footprinting element is going to make any difference. And I think that's also something we have to bear in mind, and that government needs to bear in mind going forward when we're being pushed down different avenues. Is why are we producing this? We're producing a product that needs to have a market at the end, that somebody needs to buy it. And as business people, we're focused on delivering what that customer wants.
Martin Kennedy, just briefly.
Very briefly, just linking back the original question about the trees and the carbon issue. I mean, the carbon market out there is like the Wild West. I mean, nobody's got any control of this. It's just gone like that. And the values that you see from £2 up to £80 for carbon is incredible. And yet, I'm in favour of trees if it's integrated within the farming unit, and that trees is used for forestry. It's going to go into construction, it's going to go into tables and chairs, buildings, whatever it's going to be. Absolutely fantastic. But when you see it going into wood chip, and we're bringing 130% of the wood chip we can produce in the UK is actually burnt in Drax, and some of that's coming from South Carolina across here and then going up into the atmosphere. That is nuts. That needs to stop. That is just ridiculous. It's morally wrong, it's ethically wrong, and it's financially wrong as well. Just very briefly on the carbon market and the offsetting, I know you're saying that we shouldn't use it for offsetting, but that's what's happening. It's happening now. Back in COP26, the worst day I had was I met two people that were there from the States, and I spoke to them for a while, asked them, sociable kind of guy, got on the crack with them, and they said, what are you over here for? Oh, we're over looking for opportunities to plant trees to offset carbon for our industries back in the States. And I thought, you parasites. And it was the only thing, that came to mind. These are our carbon assets, and they should be put on the products we're selling. We're going to sell it from under our feet. We've got a fantastic opportunity to export or to use at home products that we can deliver in a carbon positive manner, and yet we're selling it to industries that are not changing their practice. They're not using it for the right reasons. They're using it to offset their own failings, to address their own emissions in their own country.
Gentleman at the back there, just say who you are and where you're from, please.
Hi, Ben McClymont, mixed farmer south of Edinburgh. It's on the back of Tom's question about trees, and George said it, that in Scotland we should be planting more trees. But what can be done to stop good quality agricultural land being planted in trees that ultimately is lessening the production of food in Scotland?
George, can you just answer that quickly?
Okay. I mean, I think, as you know, there are already protections in place for the better classes of agricultural land. Ultimately, it's not something that government has control over, and probably I think we'd prefer to live in a country where government can't dictate, how you use your farm or who you can sell your land to. So there is an element that the market is the place that's going to determine what's done. But all that we are promoting is on, and again I'm agreeing with Martin, we're making a bit of a habit of this, the integration of woodland with farming is the right way to go. I recall, back in the 70s and 80s when there were particular, tax measures at the time, and you got, whole swathes of land. Some of the land that my family comes from ended up being sort of planted out in trees, probably that haven't really grown terribly well since then. We need to avoid those mistakes. So really, what we're promoting is the integration of trees with farms. And if you look at actually what our forestry colleagues are doing in terms of forestry grants, more than half of the grants are going to plantation of less than 20 hectares at a time. So this isn't the big estates or whole farms being taken out of production. It's relatively small areas. So the bulk of the money is going into that smaller integrated approach to forestry.
Thank you. So that's tree planting. Renewables. We've got a question from Scott McIntosh.
Hi, Scott McIntosh here from the Bank of Scotland. How does the panel see the future of onshore wind and other renewables, along with any support packages for this technology?
How does the panel see the future of onshore wind and other renewables, along with any support packages for this technology? George, I apologise for coming to you repeatedly, but as the government representative.
Right. Okay. I mean, the energy sector is not my particular area of expertise, although I do work closely with the colleagues that are. I mean, if you look at renewables, this is an area where Scotland has made remarkable progress. There are times when 100% of Scotland's electricity is being generated from renewables, and over the last couple of decades, lots of farmers have taken advantage of that. Not necessarily the big wind farms. I'm not thinking of the likes of Whiteley's, but the 1 or 2 turbines on the farm. So opportunities to create a new income for the farm, and we've also seen the benefits that some of that can have for rural communities. The number of community assets like village halls that have been upgraded and helped to maintain those communities on the back of wind farm money. Where's it going now? So this is very much a sort of personal comment rather than anything on behalf of government. I think we're probably seeing more moving into offshore wind, probably more into tidal and other forms of renewable energy like that. So I'm not sure how much more opportunity there is still left to be got on from onshore wind. But to say that's not from a particularly well-informed position that I'm saying that.
Martin Kennedy, do you?
Yeah, I think where government could help actually here is the ability to have far better access to grid connection and cheaper affordability for grid connection, because that's causing us a lot of grief at the minute. Because we've got huge capacity, huge opportunity here to even create and produce our own fertiliser with green hydrogen. And that hydrogen surely has to be one of the biggest advantages going forward. And we've got the weather, we've got the ability to, we've got the landscapes to do it, we've got businesses that could actually rely on it and benefit from it just now. But the connection is a real problem at the minute, and the cost of that connection. A lot of our members are consistently say, well, there's a figure's come from somewhere, but it's up there in the sky somewhere. I don't know just exactly where it came from, but it's got another couple of nothings added to it just to get the connection, and that's a real issue. And we've got an ability here to be more sustainable and less reliant on purchased, imported products if we could create our own fertiliser and our own energy. And we talk about, it frustrates me sometimes when we always talk about energy and we only associate energy with oil and gas, electricity. Actually, the most important energy source we need is food. And we tend to forget that. We should be associating that and linking it with energy far more than what we do. Because if the lights went off and the heating went off, we could put a jacket on, we could light a candle or whatever. I know that's being blunt and partially ridiculous, but the reality is we can live without that. We cannot live without food. So let's try and associate the two together. So linking, using technology. I mean, and Sally's already said the technology that's getting used in the dairy sector, the efficiency that's getting used in the dairy sector now, if that was replicated across the world, we could probably do without 2/3 of the cows, because it's done superly efficiently in the UK and other countries. But let's focus on that technology and use it to our advantage. So I think we could do more. I think assistance and connection and cost of connection would make a massive difference to the industry.
I was just thinking of Orkney, where there's so many onshore wind, onshore turbines, and it's different, isn't it? They're not tend to be on separate farms or on homesteads, and that's been quite successful. But I guess you need the connection for that. But that would be surely a positive thing for farmers, and with storage improving so much, battery storage. But it's always been an issue, hasn't it, with not so much in Scotland, but with the visual aspect of having those turbines in rural areas.
Sally Williams.
So we've got a turbine at home, and much to Martin's horror, I'm sure after his little statement about burning wood, we also have a biomass boiler. And for me, you've got the big picture issues with the grid connection and the exporting of power, but for us it was about becoming self-sufficient and trying to protect ourselves from the vagaries of the market. So we now have a drying floor, and we dry our own sawdust on farm. So I'm not using gas or bringing in stuff that I've had to spend extra money on. Our sawmill is 1.5 miles away from the farm. We're bringing it in, we're drying it, and I'm using it, and that has improved the health and welfare of my cows. So there's the self-sufficiency element that I think everybody needs to look into. We always forget about solar panels. How many of us at home have massive, great big sheds, huge roof space? I think we should all be investing in solar panels and looking at that. And even if it's just for keeping your lights on in your cattle shed, fine. But we do actually, from a business perspective, it's something that we're going to have to do from the bank's perspective, which is where you're potentially coming from. I've no idea in terms of the future. Support packages, I think the days of them are gone. And admittedly, if the feed-in tariff and the renewable heat incentive hadn't been there, would we have put our turbine up and our biomass boiler in? Realistically not. But I keep being assured that the prices of all these things are going to come down now that the subsidy is gone. We'll watch this space for that.
So it's talked about wind, biomass boilers, solar panels, anaerobic digestion. Nicola.
Yeah, I was just going to make a plug for anaerobic digestion on farm as well, because I think that actually feeds right into the whole argument of circularity, on the farm. Can you use what you're already producing? And, you don't have to put it in a slurry tank. You can actually use it and make energy from it. It does come back to the question about infrastructure, but even if you can use that energy on site.
On farm.
Yeah.
Is there a food security issue with that, though? Are we going to end up using our land to fill anaerobic digesters?
Not if you are focusing on the waste. Okay, so yeah, obviously you don't want to take away food production from that.
Many of these issues that we're talking about this evening do stem from government policy, and with that in mind, Robert McBride, you've got a question.
Yeah, Robert McBride, beef farmer from Dumfries, so go the beef. I was just wondering, going forward, what the panel's thoughts are on Nicola Sturgeon's resignation and how that's going to affect future ag policy going forward.
Thanks, Robert. What impact will Nicola Sturgeon's resignation have on Scotland's future agricultural policy? I'm going to ask you, Sally Williams, do you have a wish list?
Everyone's got a wish list. Of course we have a wish list. But I suspect mine would remain a wish and have no connection to reality whatsoever. Rab, Nicola Sturgeon's resignation in theory should have no effect because our civil service are super busy sorting out the ag bill, and hopefully will communicate to all of us the rules and regulations imminently that we're going to have to adhere to in the very near future. So sadly though, actually I think it'll make no difference simply because they're still trying to figure out what on earth they're going to do, and it's not going to matter who's sitting in that seat.
Martin Kennedy.
I would agree. It shouldn't actually make any difference because it's not Nicola Sturgeon that's been driving this, and I think it's got to be still industry-led. If you ever want an industry to change, and this goes back to the previous Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs said to me, if you want an industry to change, let the industry lead it, because they're the ones that understand it. And I think that's the way we should continue to do that. And at the minute, I think there's traction happening. It's slow. I've always got frustrations of how slow that's actually going. But in terms of where my worry would be with Nicola Sturgeon's resignation is depending on who the successor is going to be, who nobody knows who that's going to be yet. What will that cause from a reshuffle point of view? Is that going to change the dynamics within Scottish Government's ministers, cabinet secretaries? We don't know that yet. So I'd like to think that it should be left to the industry to keep leading this. We can change, we are changing, but let's get recognition for what we're doing. But my view is the same as Sally's. It shouldn't really halt that process at all, and it'd be concerning if it did.
You as Scottish NFU President, you have to work closely with the government. George this evening has agreed with you on a number of points. Are you too close to the government, Martin? I mean, some people
quite often, there's loads of people suggest I'm too close to government. I'd actually rather be in there and running it, to be honest. If we really can I actually get close enough? But I think it's all right being critical, but being honestly really blunt here. It's very difficult influencing decisions getting made when you're standing outside and not having been in that position to try and influence. And I'm there representing the industry to the best of my ability, as is the whole of NFU Scotland. But the reality is, it comes back to my first point, is let the industry lead this, and we'll do it in a manner that's done by, there's 1% of our population put the food on our tables, but it seems to be there's 99% other 99% of the experts. And that's really, really frustrating, because I think we'll go hungry a lot quicker if we left it to any one of these other 99% to actually deliver it for us. We are the experts in the room, let's not forget that. And we're doing it really well, because business resilience, the people that are still farming and crofting now are pretty good at it, because if they weren't, they wouldn't be there. Yes, there's always, I know there's probably 80% of farmers think they're in the top 20%, that'll never ever change. But the reality is, businesses move on. We'll have to go into a changing dynamic with agriculture, and we're up for it, absolutely up for it. I mean, I get criticised because I'm too optimistic, but you'll never sell an industry being negative. I mean, and I'll be blunt again, going to some meetings, it's quite, jinx, that was tough. Let's try and be upbeat and sell the industry, because we'll never sell that to our consumer if we're negative all the time. We've got the best industry in the world. Again, the only industry we cannot do without. So let's celebrate it more and sell that and change in a manner that we can drive it forward.
George, I don't know how much you can say really, but is your relationship with Martin, is it too cosy? Do you listen to what he says and implement it? Is he running the show?
I'm really keen to hear this answer, actually.
I was going to say, as a civil servant, I should probably plead the Fifth Amendment on this one, but I will come to your question. We were super busy before Nicola Sturgeon decided to resign. We are still super busy. So the business of government has not stopped. There are bound to be changes, but we have dealt with that in the past. That said, we've had remarkable stability in Scotland. If you think back, we have had effectively 4 farming ministers since 1999, and if you think of those 4 characters, I'd probably say all of them have been enthusiastic supporters of the sector. So I think that's a remarkable level of support and stability that the sector has enjoyed. For the 3rd time this evening, I'm going to agree with Martin, the importance of farmers leading in this. And you can look back to the work of the farmer-led groups. You can look at the work that's now being done in ARIOB, the Agriculture Reform Implementation Oversight Board. We should have got busier with getting some better acronyms. That's co-chaired by Marie Goujon and by Martin. We have some good discussions there, some robust discussions, but we're trying to work together, government, industry, and the other people that have an interest in this sector. It may, sometimes feel a bit slow, but hopefully through that we will get to an outcome that is good for all. The risk is, as we've perhaps seen elsewhere, government motors ahead with a policy and then industry saying, wait a minute, this just isn't going to work.
Thank you. Could I ask Robert McBride, what do you think, if you had one thing that you would like the government to do, or what would it be?
I'm very much in favour of maximising production, and that's what I try and do on the farm. I'm just worried, probably going forward, that I know the environmental needs pushed as well, but I'm worried that the environmental gets pushed too much and food production gets reduced, and we have to tick boxes to keep everyone happy on the environmental front rather as pushing food.
Thank you. I'll come to you in a moment, Martin. Before this evening kicked off, we asked Laura, could you go to Lizzie? Before this evening kicked off, we asked people on Twitter and Instagram if they would like to submit a question if they couldn't be here this evening. Lizzie McLaughlin from Farmers Weekly has got a question that's been sent in. Lizzie.
Yeah, so we had a question from Morgan Taylor, and they said, if you could change or remove only one agricultural law or legislation tomorrow, what would it be and why?
I'm going to go Sally.
Thanks.
You got to think quickly to be on this panel.
No, I'm going to be really dull and actually give a kind of on-the-fence answer. I have sat on a number of committees in my life, including at European level, and I have huge sympathy with every law and regulation that comes in. No matter how stupid they may seem, it generally has stemmed from people trying to do better. and I'm going to be proved wrong because I'm sure Martin will list 50 things that he hates in his day-to-day life. But there's nothing. There's things that frustrate me that I'd rather not have to deal with, but I have to accept, MVZs. I hate the regulations, I hate dealing with it, but I have to accept it's as a result of a consequence, and that's why it's there. So sorry for the bland, on-the-fence answer, but actually there's nothing I can think of that doesn't improve our health and safety, animal welfare, whatever. There is a reason for everything. Sorry.
Martin Kennedy, not 50 things,
No.
but just maybe one. That
Yeah, so one did come straight to mind when the question was asked, and it was planning. Planning, because we can do so much with planning that would help, whether it's affordable housing for people that are really struggling to get onto that ladder just now because we cannot get houses, or whether it's planning to allow development of businesses that are proactive in agriculture that can't go forward. Now, whether that's to do with renewables, whether it's to do with putting solar panels on or wind turbines, sort some of the planning regulation that's holding this country back seriously.
Sorry, I'm going to be a pain and jump in. The problem isn't the regulations, it's the people enforcing them. Because you can go, seriously, you go around the different regions of Scotland and somebody can get a house somewhere in Fife that I have no chance in the borders, and likewise. So actually, it's not the regs, it's the people.
Yeah. Nicola Holden, Professor of Food Safety, from your point of view, if you could change something, if you had, I don't know, Nicola Sturgeon's job for a day?
I think what I would really like to see is much more emphasis on the fundamental need for healthy, nutritious food. Okay, I would like, in my world, everyone would take much more responsibility for themselves, and they would pay much more attention to the fundamental nutritional benefits of good food and high quality food. And so I would really like to see, it's not necessarily a regulation, but just a much more, a much more basic need for that awareness, I think.
Thank you. Louise?
I'd sort of carry on from that and talk about the right to food, which is a human right, according to the UN, and it's something they're trying to get into the Good Food Nation bill, which I wanted to ask. I didn't know whether it came up in the audience that they felt that agriculture gets focused on as the problems to the environment, but it's not agriculture, is it? It's food production, and we all eat food, so we're all responsible for it. And so the Food Nation bill is. I'm interested to what the rest of the panel think. If that's going to help at all with but in terms of smaller rules, maybe feeding pigs and chickens food waste again. It happens in other countries, in Taiwan and the Far East, and that would seem like a good way to reduce food waste. And the only other one I thought was in Scotland was selling Highland estates based on how many deer are there. That seems that time has passed. Let's move on from that one.
Thank you. I know we said we were going to release this as a podcast and put it on YouTube, but I'm sure that Mary Gujon won't watch it. So, George, what would you do?
Well, I speak to Mary Gujon on a regular basis, so I'll tell her to watch it. I'll maybe point her to some bits rather than others. What one law? Well, actually, that's the right approach, that we look at individual laws, because some of them have had their time. And that's a more constructive approach than we're seeing with a certain bill in Westminster, which would basically wipe loads and loads of laws off the statute book, regardless of whether we need them. And there's a huge amount of work. I said earlier, we're super busy. A lot of that busyness at the moment is unfortunately identifying these bits of EU-derived law that we actually still need, that do serve a purpose, and having to do quite a bit of work to just put them back on the shelf again. I would rather that we were spending time on the Agriculture Bill or the implementation of what's actually now the Good Food Nation Act, because that's a much more positive use of our time. I'm not sure how much this audience has engaged with the Good Food Nation Act, but actually that's something that is looking for us to join up, right from farm to fork and beyond, and set out the holistic food policy. And actually it's an opportunity to demonstrate the importance of primary production in the whole food system. So it will place it places duties on us as central government. It will place duties on local authorities and the health boards in particular to prepare their plans and show what they are doing to contribute on food, including food security.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you answering that. Is there anybody from the audience who's got something that they would put in room 101 or get rid of? You're all happy.
I should have said, I've actually, because I'm that sad individual, spent some time going through the statute book in relation to agriculture, and I'm proposing to Marie Goujon some bits of legislation that we can get rid of, including the ones involved in setting up the Board of Agriculture way back in 19 Oat Cake.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end of our evening. We've time for a couple more questions before we do. Lucy McClymont.
Good evening. Lucy McClymont, kite consultant, Dumfries. Agriculture and many other industries are currently facing a labour crisis. How can we make a career in farming more appealing to the next generation?
Thank you, Lucy. How can we make a career in farming more appealing for the next generation? Just as an aside, I got a press release today from Arla, which the dairy processing company, farmer-owned dairy processing company, and it was saying that I believe they'd done a study and it said 1 in 3 youngsters want a career that can help combat climate change. But none of them had, or very, very few of them had heard of or considered a career in farming. So it's a really pertinent and timely question. How can we make a career in farming more appealing for the next generation? Louise Gray.
Get more women involved. There was a report out a couple of years ago, Women in Agriculture, which said that there were still cultural barriers to women entering agriculture. And I think there's lots in livestock, but not so many in arable. And part of that might be, it's the focus on, I just think they're the positive things, like, so many people want to be involved in climate change. There's so much, you're going to be using drones and precision agriculture, and just look at Sally, get the women involved, that's what I'd say.
Sally Williams.
Well, given that there's a female arable farmer just there.
Yeah. But there's just less.
There may be less. For me, it comes back to actually the point I made earlier about society having to take responsibility for their food and an acceptance of that. And it is going to require societal change. Agriculture is still viewed as the thing for school kids to go into. When they get to 4th year, they want to leave school. We'll ship you off down to the local college, maybe try and get you into modern apprenticeship. Generally, the people encouraged into agriculture from an educational perspective are the disenfranchised, are the ones who aren't engaged. The other end is, and sorry to every non-farmer in this room, but how many consultants do we need? And for an awful lot of people, they go to college, university, they study agriculture, and if they aren't lucky enough to have a farm to go home to or a plan back into, and it's still management, that's the route we go. And it's about reminding people actually there is a huge pride in those of us that end up destroying their thumb or getting covered in bruises because they've been working with livestock. There is a huge sense of achievement at the end of every day. And again, it comes back to my point earlier about we have to stop apologising for what we're doing. And how many of us have gone to a meeting and you're asked, what's your job title? Oh, I'm a director. Sod that, I'm a farmer and I'm damn proud to be a farmer. And until every single one of us goes out there and actually talks about what we do with pride, nothing is going to change. And it's all fine and well, we're here to combat climate change, we're here to do whatever. I am here to milk cows. That is what I love, it's what I maybe don't dream about doing, but it's certainly it's certainly what I get up in the morning to do. And my entire day is spent thinking about how can I do my job better? How can I enthuse my staff to do my job better? In terms of encouraging people in, it is a societal thing, but it's also at us, each individual farmer. I challenge everybody to have taken on or at least spoken to a young person about coming into agriculture. And I don't mean an SAC student, sorry, SRUC for any SRUC boards in here.
Yes.
You know, actually just go out and speak to young people, get involved in RET and show them that it is a perfectly normal occupation to do. The other thing is we also have to accept we're maybe going to have to revolutionise, and there's been huge pushback on this 4-day working week and how it would not work in agriculture because we have to look after our livestock 7 days a week. Yes, we do, but 4 days doesn't mean Monday to Thursday. Let's be a little bit creative. And Rory Christie, you'll have seen, tried doing 4 days on, 4 days off, or 8 days on, 8 days off. Let's think outside the box instead of being obsessed with working 100 hours a week and being proud of working 100 hours a week. I am proud of spending time with my children. My life is better because I get off farm and spend it with sometimes with my husband, but generally with my children. And I think that's also, we have to stop being such martyrs. I remember the story of my dad going to a farming dinner and sitting next to a dairy farmer who was proud that he had not missed a morning milking for 25 years. Get a life. We need to get away from that. There you go.
Right, thanks.
I think that links in with what you're saying about women, because it's about flexible childcare, isn't it? Where at the beginning of careers, women being able to know that they can have some childcare.
I'm going to come to Nicola and George just in a moment, but just first, Martin.
Yeah, I think we can do a lot more when it comes to education. I think on Louise's point about we need more women, you need to come onto my farm and see how, because I've got a wife and 3 daughters that are just, and honestly, and you know, in terms of getting involved in agriculture, women are driving, I mean, Sally, you know, driving things forward. They're doing a fantastic job, and I totally agree. But the ridiculous thing is, at the minute, we have got the best industry in the world, and we're not talking about it. We don't talk about it in the schools, and it's all right. You're spot on. We get to 4th year, and you've maybe no hit the grades, and yeah, we'll go to agriculture, we'll go to agricultural college. Get into primary school. Now, we're trying to talk with government with this just now to try and get this educated in primary. Because if climate change is top of the agenda, if the environment is top of the agenda, now food production is top of the agenda, why are we not talking about it? The STEM subjects that's involved in agriculture now is colossal. Now, you think about it when you're talking about changing diets, you're talking about soil analysis that is to a fantastic degree now, and you know, it's the science that's involved in agriculture now is phenomenal, and we could learn so much from a STEM subject's point of view. In agriculture, we should be talking about it in primary. So let's get into the primary and get them to think, yes, I want to be a climate enthusiast. I want to look after the climate. How do I do that? I produce my food better and I respect it and value it instead of just taking it for granted and we're only spending so much for it and it'll not matter about the rest. We'll throw that in the bucket. We don't value it anymore. So let's get that value instilled in our youngest generation and start it in the primary schools. That's where we need to be.
Thank you. Nicola, Holden, how are you encouraging more people into agriculture or at least farming-related sectors?
Yeah, no, I've been listening to all of these comments and they're all great, and thank you very much for highlighting the STEM issue. I think one of the main benefits of farming, or you know, the agri-food production system, is the diversity of different jobs and tasks that there are there. There's so many different opportunities. So, you know, I think that's one of the things to do, is to go out there, as you say, communicate. And yes, we do RET, absolutely. It's a fabulous facility or, you know, activity to undertake. But then to go and explain about all of the different opportunities there are out there. So we have, you know, great opportunities in big data. You need to take the aspects that really switch the kids on, switch the young students on, and then push those buttons, absolutely. So yeah, I think we, I mean, we've got lots of examples of, you know, where we have got people that have gone down a very traditional route, but then we've got lots of examples as well of people that have come in completely left-wing, and they didn't, you know, imagine that they would be working in the agri-food system, but then here they are. I think the other thing I would just like to say is everyone's obsessed with food. If we go right to the end, to the food end, what's on people's plates? I mean, you see it obviously on all the socials. What do people do when they go to a restaurant? They always take a picture of what they're eating. Okay, why don't we use that? Why don't we use that angle as well? So I think there's lots of opportunities there. And I must admit, it's one of the greatest privileges of being an SRUC person or being involved in education, is being able to see that development and see those switch-on moments.
Thank you. The gentleman just over there.
Hi, Craig Davidson from SRUC. This is a very passionate question, and I think it's very relevant to what I do. In my previous years, I taught 500 daily high school students about agriculture, and about 99% of them never came from farms. And and just like Martin was saying, these folk were getting science credits, they were getting chemistry credits, they were getting biology, they were getting technology credits, so there was mechanical elements as well. So depending on the class, they had a variety of different options. Out of that, so if we kept them for 4 years in high school, we would end up seeing about 60% of them going into an agricultural degree of some sort. Now, clearly there's nothing like that in the UK, but I'd be very interested to hear what the government's thoughts are in improving some of that access in schools. And rightly so, Sally, you said it's looked at as a kind of a dumping ground in a lot of cases. What are we doing from a government perspective to give access to students in the schools at an early age to get those folk in there?
There's probably a question for somebody involved in education rather than agriculture, but
yeah, but I'll go back to the original question and some of the comments. You know, as an industry, we don't always really encourage people into agriculture. So I come from a farming background. Father was a farmer, grandfather's a farmer. The one bit of career advice I got from my mother was, don't be a farmer. Now, after many years of unpaid work, I wasn't exactly rushing into the sector. It has to be said, but sometimes we're not really encouraging the next generation unless they're really committed to it. But at the risk of agreeing with Martin for the fourth time tonight, and it really has to stop. I mean, agriculture, farming has changed so much. It is about the STEM subjects and applying that. So it's not just the place that the kids that they couldn't do their O levels or whatever, or we'll send them off to the rural studies department and that'll do fine. Farming now is actually a far more complicated, maybe academic subject than it was in the past. Been a couple of mentions of RET, the work with RET to engage with school kids across the country. So not just rural schools is really important. So that's something that we've been funding. That's obviously been, during COVID, that's had to be set back. So I think there's really a need now to push that on. You may be aware there's been a recent sort of rural skills review that and has made a whole set of recommendations that we're now looking at, and I think that will be important as to how we connect, the school kids, the people returning to work today into what jobs the rural economy now has to offer.
Thank you, George. Final.
Sorry, Johan, can I interrupt and be a pain? I think the replies have again highlighted for me, everybody gets carried away with the science and technology and the management level stuff. The shortage of labour on farm is the whole length of it. I still need somebody I milk cows with robots. Wow, technologically advanced, wonderful. I still need somebody to walk around and scrape shit off beds. Mm-hmm. Full stop, end of story. You don't need a degree to do that. You don't need a diploma. You don't need anything. You just need empathy with the animals to make sure you're not scaring them as you go around. And I think, again, it comes back to the point I was trying to make about us being proud of a job being well done and the job satisfaction that gives you, instead of encouraging everybody to chase the heady heights of management and the high level of further education, that actually it really comes back to this sense of pride in a job well done, and stop obsessing over how many letters we can get after our name.
Yeah. Room for everybody in agriculture, I hope. I'm going to move it on to our last question. Martin Hall.
You were hoping your mic didn't pick that up.
Martin Hall, agricultural valuer from West Lothian. How do we ensure we have the right people, the right use on the right land?
And I guess this is just not about recruiting more people into agriculture per se, but just to explain it briefly what you mean by that, and we'll go through the panel and ask.
What I mean by that is sort of cuts across all of what you've been talking about this evening. It talks about the skills, having the right people, doing the right jobs. It talks about having the right land use on the right land, whether that's forestry, agriculture, energy, whatever that may be. And so it deals with a bit of that, and it also deals with the stratification of the sector. From having the young people coming in to the old people going out to give the opportunities to the other end of the spectrum. So a bit of all of that.
A bit of all of that, a potentially huge question, but the bar is waiting. So I'm going to ask the panel if they can keep it as brief as possible, but certainly do give Martin's question the attention that it deserves. So Martin, starting with you.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually that broke from that perspective. I don't think we're that far off the mark from the integration of the right people doing the right things. Probably need to integrate it slightly better. So looking at it from a forestry perspective and an agricultural perspective, communication probably needs to be greater. I think that's been started. Mary McCallum's just launched a consultation on how we actually integrate that better now. So just this, for the record, I'm actually agreeing with the government this time. It's not the other way around. So, but the reality is that's what we've been pushing for a long time. Let's get that understanding. So communication is absolutely key in this. So, but everybody, so we don't have this right to roam, but we've got a right to access, and we have got our general public that wants to take advantage of that as well. We take it for granted. I get up in the morning, every morning, and look across and think, I actually don't think this is fantastic because I've taken it for granted. There's a society out there that needs to have that opportunity to see that as well. In terms of public good, we should probably welcome that. I mean, we mentioned RET. We did Open Farm Sunday, best event ever. Did I think I got more out of it than what the people that were coming, because you were speaking to people, so, and broad ranging. So I don't think it's actually that broken. Let's just highlight the going back to Sally's point, highlight that this is a fantastic industry. We want to do this and we want everybody involved, but everybody should have their share in it responsibly. I don't think it's that broken.
Thank you, Martin. Nicola.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think communication and collaboration, I think that's really key, absolutely key here, and going right across the system from primary food production right through to the end product as well. So you need to have all of the players in the room. And you know, we've got some really good examples of that. We've mentioned as well the Good Food Nation. That, you know, that required a consortium of people to come together to push in order to get that bill passed. But of course, we had the Scotland Food and Drink Ambition 2030 as well. And I mean, many of the people in, you know, or organisations in this room were involved in that. That's a lovely example of really good collaboration. So I think that, yeah, more of that, but going right across the system is what's needed.
Thank you, Nicola. George Burgess.
How do we get the right people, the right activities in the right place? Well, I'll tell you the answer is not that you get government to decide at all. It didn't work for Stalin, and it certainly wouldn't work for us. Yeah, I'm going to agree with Martin again. You know, the system is not broke, but I think we can look at the incentives that we've got. You know, we do put a lot of money into the sector. Are we incentivizing the right things? Are we creating perverse incentives? Answers on a postcard, please, because that will help us to make sure that we are helping as far as we can to get the right things in the right place.
Thank you. Sally Williams.
Martin, I think the challenge is who decides who the right people are, what the right use is, and what the right land would be. And at the moment, it's driven by market forces. And as much as George wishes that the government aren't legislating and affecting that, at the end of the day, every single regulation and law that they pass does affect the market that we are operating in. At the end of the day, for those who are trying to buy land and are competing with people that want to plant trees, they've got no chance. Although I'm assured by a Strutton Parker person that bubble has burst and life is going to return to normality. So I think it's the market. The market will decide where the people go, how the land is used. Yeah, as a personal example, we are one of the very few dairy farms left in the borders, and a lot of people challenge me, why on earth are you milking cows here? We've got straw in abundance all around us. We've got grain, ooh, carbon disaster, grain that I can feed our cattle, and we can grow grass. So from my perspective, where we are is perfect. But any Lanarkshire or Westies who might be dairying would argue quite strongly that actually no, where I'm farming is the most stupid place and I should go to beef and sheep. But it's the market forces, and I think that will ever be thus.
I was going to use a personal example as well, coming back to the forestry question earlier, about the right tree in the right place. My dad, when he planted trees, did the hinging, and it worked really well, but some of them died because they were just planted. And then he did it 20 years later, and they used GPS technology so they could know the type of soil and plant it where they would actually grow. And then now I'm doing it, and they're like looking at the mycorrhiza. They're like going in such detail. So I just thought it was a nice story of how we are developing science in order to find the right things to grow in the right place. And I said the wrong thing, sorry. But hopefully that means more farmers are able to bring more diversity in, because as Sally said, it's all market forces. No one can plant anything unless there's a market for it, but diversity is something I think that would benefit farmers as well.
Thank you. I'm going to give the opportunity to have the last word of the evening to the person who asked the question. Martin Holden, how do you think we should ensure that we have the right people and the right use and the right land?
Well, I think we've never had such a time of change as we're seeing just now. Not for 50 years within the sector, and so if there's ever a time to have a look at this, it's probably now. And with all the pressures that are there, I agree it's quite difficult. Who decides? As Sally said, it is a tricky question. But we also should challenge ourselves to be thinking about a bit about the recruitment into the sector, how do we bring in diversity? How do we bring, and that isn't just not just offspring of farmers. How do new ideas come into the sector? So it's a bit of all of that, I think, and so we should just be challenging ourselves on that front.
Thank you very much. It's a challenge for everybody. That's it for this evening's Farmers Weekly Question Time, and I have to say it's been great to be here at SRUC Oatridge. And before we go and carry on the conversation in the bar, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thank you to our sponsors, AB Agri and Bank of Scotland. I'd like to thank our panel, award-winning environmental author Louise Gray, dairy farmer Sally Williams, Scottish Government Director of Agriculture and Rural Economy George Burgess, Professor of Food Safety Nicola Holden, and NFU Scotland President Martin Kennedy. But most of all, I would like to thank everybody who's come along for coming this evening. It's great to have you with us, and I know it wasn't easy for everybody to get here, so thank you very much. You'll be able to listen to this again online at fwi.co.uk/question time. But for now, I'm your host, Johan Tasker. Thank you again for coming along, and I believe the bar will be open. Thank you.